I think when we talk about deploying on Fridays of, deploy 5 p.m. Friday, I know we were just talking about how, it's when you scratch the surface even remotely, most people, there's not really a good reason. It's just hiding some sort of, stupid reason, honestly. But I do believe that there are legitimate reasons for not deploying on a Friday. I'm thinking if you're working for a company and the company's busiest time of the week is Friday and Saturday. I'm thinking maybe like a hotel chain, as an example.
Mm.
Maybe they want to go out on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, which they know traditionally are kind of the slowest days. Or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is kind of the traditionally slowest days because they're the business risk of being wrong doesn't justify it. But there's also something to be said, like why is your software so brittle that it breaks all the time that they have to have a
Yeah.
rule like that in place?
I
But
I will always accept a business reason. Sometimes the
yeah,
business reasons need a bit of work, right? I worked at a online retailer who must have had a really bad deployment one Christmas, and Christmas is super important to them. It's like they
yeah,
make literally all of their money. The rest of the year is like staying afloat, and then Christmas they
yeah.
make some profit. They must have had a really bad deployment experience, banned deployments for December, January, February, no deployments for 3 months, right? Which is quite scary.
Yeah.
And one of their brands had an error in their JavaScript, and the error would surface. It was they were doing a card layout, and they were using JavaScript to cut the text on the card to make the cards all the same height. This is before we had nice things like CSS Grid and such like. And if it just so happened that the space like was the exact number of characters, the code had a bug in it, which meant it went into an infinite loop. So if you did a product search and it included a product that had a description that was just the right length, the page would get that thing where the JavaScript just tight loops, and then the browser keeps going, "Oh, something's gone horribly wrong. Do you want to stop this page?" Right? So
Mhm.
you couldn't carry on and do anything. There was no way of actually proceeding and buying, right? So this is like a critical error. And I fixed it, right? Hooray, fixed it, ready for Christmas. But December was already here, so they wouldn't
Mm,
deploy it. So they left it broken for 3 months, like rather than deploy the fix. Really
yeah,
simple fix.
Yeah.
So it's like that's the problem when it becomes a fear-based decision. Now,
Mhm.
there totally are legitimate reasons. There are some businesses who like there's a point in the year or there's a point in the week where that's like busy time. Let's not mess around during busy time. Totally get the business justification. But the
Mhm.
technical justifications worry me, especially when it's um, based on that. We don't want developers to have to work outside of hours, but then they haven't calculated how long their recovery time is to know when that freeze would have to be. Because,
Mhm.
like, the kind of organization that can't deploy on demand is usually the kind of organization that can't recover in less than, 8 hours. So, if something goes wrong on any day, it's going to cause antisocial hours. Um,
Mhm.
I
I, I, oh, sorry, I know I was
go,
just gonna say
go ahead.
I did work, and it was kind of I'm not a developer, so like if somebody if I ask somebody, hey, we need to deploy this thing, and somebody said can't do it, it's Friday. Like in a previous world, in a previous role, I took them at face value. It's like cool, there's a reason we can't do it, but it did start to then creep into Thursdays. It's like we can't do it on Thursdays either because it's close to Friday. You're kind of like this is a little bit suspect now. And look, we weren't deploying anything business critical. It was like some website, maybe a button change or whatever. It was nothing that was gonna either be a major fix or something that couldn't be recovered fairly quickly. But it's I also wonder how much of this is sometimes inherited knowledge. Like Dave, he worked here 6 years ago, says we can't do it on Friday. And everyone that comes in after Dave might be here anymore, but the message has persisted to me. And nobody really knows why we don't do it. They have some idea that some stuff might break, but to your point, they haven't really worked it out. But like, most of those things we could probably fix in 30 minutes. What's the
Yeah,
problem?
I always I come back to the user impact as well. You know, if we do this deployment, for I think a really classic example would be if I do a deployment in the middle of the day to say a retail store, and it's to the point of sale machines. What is the potential impact of that? You know, are you changing the UI or are you adding new functionality? Now, there's arguments to be made that hey, that's what feature toggles are for, and that's what you should be using feature toggles to make sure you don't adversely affect the users. But you might do something or might push something out that's not behind a feature toggle for bug fix reason, or hey, there's a logical reason. We change how we calculate certain things, and so you don't want to have this unexpected behavior for your user base during a critical business hour. I also I worked at a company, and it was written into the contract that we wouldn't have
Wow.
any outages that exceeded 15 minutes for maintenance unless it was 2 a.m. Saturday. Um, that was awful. But that was
There's
written
your
into the
window.
contract. Yeah, that was the
Oh,
that was the that was the what was written into the contract, and so it's like, well, can't do that. That's a business reason for something like that. And then we also had
yeah.
I worked at a bank, and the company policy was is if there are any deployments during business hours, you needed to get approval from two leaders to kind of justify it. Now,
Mm,
you could definitely do it in the middle of the day if you needed to do it, but you needed to have a better reason than I just want to get out of here soon. There
mm,
has to be a legitimate business reason because again, this was a bank, and you could be impacting our user base, which would prevent us from doing loans and generating money,
mm.
and that's a big no no, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. My own banking app, I would still get notifications, you know, this your app is going to be down between whatever
hmm
2 a.m. Saturday, 7 p.m. or 7 a.m. Sunday, and you're like, uh-oh, there goes
Yeah.
somebody's weekend.
Yeah, I get those as well on my
Yeah.
banking app as well. You can always
Yeah.
tell who works for who banks with a company that is online 24/7 and like that's all they do
Yeah.
versus like a
Yeah.
small regional bank like I bank with,
Yeah.
and they're like, yeah, we'll do a deployment like every once a month Sunday at midnight.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty similar to me. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Switching gears a little bit. I think it's worth Steve, you shared earlier in the week that Mr. Dave Farley has released a state of continuous delivery in 2025 report. Some interesting stuff in. Do you want to give us a bit of an intro?
Yeah, so this is an interesting report because Dave obviously brought us continuous delivery with Jez Humble in the amazing book. And he works with lots of different organizations. So I suppose to introduce it, it's just below 100 organizations that have completed an assessment that Dave Farley uses as part of his consultancy service for people to kind of work out where they are on the map. So the people answering this are people who want to be doing continuous delivery, which is like a that's the view of people we've got. But obviously they're all at different positions on that journey. Um, and it's an interesting. Probably there's a little segue here where we should talk about okay, 100 people as a sample. We know the sample is going to be people into CD. It's 100. Some people get a little bit sniffy over numbers when it comes to research, but we're kind of dealing with this thing where if we keep dismissing research because the N isn't a million or something, then we'll just carry on making decisions based on nothing. And I already prepared this book, How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard, I think his name is. He basically looks at research and measurement and metrics from the point of view of it's not about proving a law of nature. It's about making it so that you have more information to make a better decision. So I don't want
Hmm.
anyone getting sniffy over it being like 100. This is like super useful information.
Now, couldn't you like when you say because if I recall my business stats class, and this was 20 years ago, so I it might be a little fuzzy with that. Is it really? It's kind of also like the margin of error. Really, is kind of what it says almost in my mind. So if you say 57% of companies that we enter, like 57% don't do X or don't do Y, but what it could be is like, hey, because of the the sample size that we have, it could be 63% or it could be 51% based on the number
Mm.
that I've provided. But the idea is that we're getting a number that we can look at and start making some reasonable calculations and basis and some reasonable
Mm.
decisions on. And then
Yeah,
as we get more data, we can lock in even tighter.
that's right.
Mhm.
And it's like you only need about 5 samples to have very high confidence that your median
Yep.
will be between the numbers you've got, right? That's just with 5 samples. There are some caveats around what kind of data you need to have. But also, when it comes to something like this, um, does it matter if there's an elite group which is about 10%? Does it matter if it's 5% or 15%? It doesn't materially change the
Yeah.
information that you're looking at. We know that it's a smaller group than the people that are kind of in that intermediate stage, right? We can have really high confidence that those numbers are right. So yeah, I think it's useful. It's very close to real practice, and people were using this assessment because they wanted to find out where they were. So their
Yeah.
motivation is
Mm.
good for this. It's not a test. They're not trying to pass. So yeah, I'm super excited by this because it's interesting subject. Continuous delivery is still the best way we know to deliver software as of 2025. Lots of researchers already kind of back that up. Um, so this is like, what are people actually doing? So I
Now,
find that really interesting.
one question, and I'm sure this is going to come up, and I'm sure the people who are watching this are probably going to say something similar, is we just ourselves released the State of GitOps report. And I have been to conferences and I've heard people in conversations and we've talked to some customers and they've said, we don't need continuous delivery. We're doing GitOps now. Now, I have some opinions, but I'll be curious to see what your thoughts are when we compare these two reports.
So yeah, I mean this is super interesting. We've been doing software delivery now for like a long time, right? I think the earliest paper I've read of someone saying this is how we do software, it's like from the 60s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is some stuff before that even, it might not be quite as recognizable to what we're doing today, but from the 60s onwards, there's been quite a lot of agreement about the kind of stuff we should do. So people that worked on projects where they had to invent hardware to complete the project still said you should actually build something small and then evolve it towards the finished product instead of trying to create the finished thing straight away. And now we've got much better terminology around it and a much more granular understanding of the practices. But um, you know, uh, everything from the lightweight software era kind of still applies. All of the stuff that Ken Beck wrote in Extreme Programming still applies. The Mythical Man Month, except for the chapter about microfiche, because you'd probably use a different technology,
Yeah.
but the ideas they're all still relevant. So I think one of our mistakes in recent times is something exciting happens and we immediately forget everything that came before it, right? So I suppose platform engineering, super exciting. So we forget all about DevOps. But if
Yeah.
you ignore all of those practices, which includes continuous delivery and transformational leadership and psychological safety, all that stuff is still needed. So I think we should be slower to ditch all of that knowledge that has been hard won over uh, more
Mm.
years than I have even been alive.
I the analogy in my head that I come back to is that when it comes to continuous delivery is like a delivery company. So a FedEx, a UPS. I live in the United States, so United States Postal Service. GitOps is the truck that gets you there. You still need all of the logistics. You still need all of the bits and pieces to get the package ready to go. And then the question becomes, how do I get that package to my destination? And that's where, say, GitOps comes in. So in my world, the way I always look at it is that they're not a binary choice. I don't do GitOps or continuous delivery. You do both. And when you do both, that's when you start seeing the benefits of what we saw with the state of GitOps report. And so I think when we combine some of the things or some of Dave's findings, and I know that the report is a bit, it felt like it was a bit negative when I started reading the summary. Like the only so many companies do this, and this is why they're struggling. Which it's great. We need to have that. You need to be able to measure that. I think when you combine the practices that continuous delivery preaches with the practices of GitOps, that's when we start seeing that huge benefit when we were talking about the state of GitOps report of like high performing teams when we measure them with DORA metrics or deploying every day and have take less than 20 minutes to recover from any sort of service outage and all these other really interesting statistics. So you need to have both. You can't have either or.
Yeah, we we try to be really careful not to tell people a list of things that they have to do, like the kind of
Yeah,
maturity model zone, right? We try very hard not to do that. Um, but there are certain things that if you don't do them, there are very common impacts of not doing them. And if you don't mitigate those impacts in some other way, maybe you should just do the thing, right? And
yeah,
that's one of the things that this report says. Literally like 10% or 11%, somewhere in between, there was a decimal point, are the expert practitioners, right? So these are people who
10.7.
you would actually, if you were going to be judgmental, you'd say they are doing continuous delivery, right?
yeah,
Everyone else is missing something, some piece of the puzzle that makes what they're doing probably fragile. Because I always talk about extreme programming because Kent Beck drew a list of all these things and there were just lines everywhere. Because it turns out, oh, actually, the test automation supports these other things, right? And those other things support all of these other things. And it's almost like it's like a kind of house of cards. That there are certain things that if you remove them, it just can't stand up. Um, so yeah, it's we don't want to tell people you have to do this thing, but if you're seeing those problems, that is the way to solve them.
yeah,
Yeah, there was, if I put my marketing hat on for 1 second, I want to call out a very
yeah,
cool headline that sort of hooked me in. I was kind of reading to, I think it's the start of the second page, where it's like the current state, better than expected, worse than hoped. I was immediately like, oh, that's a nice way to draw somebody. Like, I want to see now what's under the hood. But there was I think there was and in some of the technical gaps section, and I know we've had a conversation on this before. One of the technical gaps was called out as like your end-to-end pipeline automation, 47%, I think it was, have a complete deployment pipeline, and the rest kind of have partial automation. But there was a recommendation at the end that called out eliminating all manual steps, implementing full pipeline automation, and then it was like including automated rollbacks. And I was like, oh, we've talked about this before. That's a spiky one. Yeah.
now
Yeah,
So,
that was, yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
go on, you go first.
Oh yeah, yeah. So it's it's always curious. I'm always curious to say, when people ask about automated rollbacks, because there are different ways to accomplish that, and I have a very long list of articles I've written about this very topic. And in my mind, if you are a continuous delivery practitioner, you're the person that's like, I'm in that 10%. What you've also adopted is not just continuous delivery, but also the kind of more of these progressive delivery strategies that are out there, such as doing
hmm.
blue-green style deployments or red-black style deployment or canary style deployment, where I'm de-risking whether or not the deployment will work. And so I've pushed that out. And if that doesn't work, then either I don't redirect my traffic or I notice a problem almost immediately because of some sort of metric, like my memory consumption skyrockets to 10x what I should normally have. I need to redirect all my traffic to be before. But if you're using things like feature toggles, a rollback is I just turn off a toggle, and so I'm
Yeah.
disabling that functionality, so I'm no longer using that. So you can get, and yes, you can have that in my world that's still automated because I push a button and it causes it to go back. Automated rollbacks is always an interesting topic because it's a who who is the thing, what is the thing that's making the decision to roll back, and you need to have something that's very deterministic. You can't leverage something. I'm always leery of leveraging something like AI because it's a non-deterministic way to make the decision of, oh, it made the determination that I needed to roll back, but it doesn't have all the context, and that's one of the flaws I think of AI is that it lacks context constantly, and so it needs to be provided context almost constantly with this. And so yeah,
Mm.
it's yes, it is a thing. I think you need to have a bunch of practices locked down before you start talking about automating rollbacks.
For
Which is
sure.
back to the this supporting practices, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
we've got to stop thinking about a technical practice in isolation.
Yes.
And I suppose it's probably worth looking at the three things that were most common causes of problems in Dave's report, which was trunk-based development not being used, a lack of test automation, um, and this concept of a complete deployment pipeline with
Mm.
that super high level of automation. And this is interesting. Dave calls this out in the report. It's really hard to do trunk-based development if you don't have test automation, right?
Yeah.
It's the supporting practices again. Um, like otherwise, you just don't know what happened. You don't know if you're deployable, and this is the whole point of continuous delivery. Is even if you're choosing not to deploy on demand, if you're saying we're going to do it, like either we're going to decide when to deploy or we're going to do it once a day or whatever it is you're doing for a business reason, you should always be in a deployable state. Um, that's the kind of that's really the goal of this is that you never put yourself in a situation where if you found that there was some crucial thing that had to be fixed, you'd be like, oh, but we can't because we're queued behind this thing which is broken, and that can't be finished until this other thing is done, which is like the old way. That's how projects used to work. You'd like everyone would have finished, and then you spend all this time being blocked behind other people's bugs and problems, and by the time those are fixed, someone else has introduced a new problem, and that's why it just snowballs and nothing ever gets deployed. Which is also why
Mm.
we want to deploy on Fridays, because otherwise we're saving that work up for Monday, and now Monday
Mm-hmm.
is twice as big, which means that
Mm.
there's slightly more chance there'll be a problem because it's a bigger batch. And if that happens, then it ends up like snowballing into a three times as big thing on Tuesday. So yeah, we're heading back towards like weekly deployments now. So we don't want to do
Mm.
that.
So the lack of fully automated CI/CD pipelines or software delivery pipelines or deployment pipelines, however you want to call it, that is that was an interesting statistic. And when I read it, I started thinking back a little bit to my developer days. And Steve, I'm kind of curious if you saw this happen as well, where I would check in my code. I would have a build. It would run my unit tests, assuming that I had them. Some applications I worked on didn't. And once it was done building, it would then say deploy up to a development environment for me. And then in some cases, it might even deploy all the way up to a test environment, assuming that it passed. But that was more of the exception than the norm. And so I had this automated process that I used to deploy up to a certain environment. And then at some point, the software is quote unquote done or baked or verified. And then I would hand it over to my operations team. And then they would have a completely different process to deploy to the upper environments, be it pre-prod, integration, staging, and then production. And I think when I see a number like that, I wonder how many companies are still doing that, where the developers have a completely different way that they deploy compared to the rest of the environments for staging and production and everything like that.
Yeah, I've seen this. I worked at a very large organization, and we saw this problem, the problem of trying to deploy a version, right? And we saw it in dev and test first because it was like, oh, I want to test the new version, and we're down tools and have to make it happen. So we wanted to automate it, and so we automated development deployments, we automated test deployments, and we were super excited because we got it to the stage where we could deploy and it worked and it took no time. And this was like the biggest pain was our production deployments because we weren't allowed to actually touch production, right? That was the rule. And so the way it was done was with a checklist. But we would stand like 6 feet away from the IT ops, like nominated team member who was doing the deployment, because they would often have a question or something would happen and they'd need to turn around and ask us. And we saw this as the big solution, right? We have used our automated deployment into dev. We've done our automated deployment into test. The natural thing is now to complete that through to production, but they were convinced that their manual process was safer, despite
Mm.
the fact that we were testing the dev and test automated deployments multiple times a week, and we only released, we were doing like quarterly releases. So the manual process was tested 4 times a year, right? It's like, so which is going to be better? The thing that you're using all the time, multiple times a week, or the thing that you hardly ever use? And it just, for me, it was obvious, but that organization also had a really generous overtime policy. People were getting paid double time. So all of the developers, all of the testers, all of the IT ops people were being given pizza and money. So the motivation to solve production deployments was super low.
Wow.
The do you think, I mean, outside of the monetary reason, I sometimes think it's when it's a company misinterpreting the whole concept of separation of concerns and separation of duties, where the person who makes the change can't be the person who deploys it up to production. And so they go, well, they almost take it to the extreme end of that spectrum when they say we even have our own mechanism for deploying to make sure that we don't have any sort of crossing of the streams in that sense.
Yeah, I've had a few audits where I've kind of had to take auditors back to standards to read through them and talk about them to get them to understand them because I've had all kinds of conversations where they think segregation of duties means that each activity has to be done by a different person.
Mm,
And in some cases, I've been on a small team, and they're asking me to have a separate person for more things than I have people. And I'm
yeah,
like, it's actually about making sure that everything has been seen by more than one person, right? That's the
yeah,
idea. If I try and slip in a office space style rounding trick to send rounding differences to my bank account, someone's going to spot that. Or if I try and switch out an artifact, like that should be prevented. We've got an artifact that we've built, we've tested, we've validated it. We want to make sure that's the same one that's used, right? So it's about stopping those very easy ways for a single person to subvert a system. It's not
yeah.
about, you know, denying someone from doing two of the tasks in this long list of things.